Let me begin with Danielle and then the lady behind her. And as usual, please tell us your name and institution. And if you have a specific person, great. If not, anybody can answer.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Resnick, also a Senior Research Fellow here at IFPRI. And I want to thank everyone for a wonderful seminar, really enlightening. Two quick questions. I guess these maybe go to the editors who have a fuller view of all the papers. One is this issue about information. Katrina's first slide kind of emphasized information's not neutral. We all have our biases, even us here as researchers. We think we do neutral information sharing, but that's not true. So in addition to institutions, with both Leonard and Toadaj talked about, what about the mediating role of kind of ideas, norms, political partisanship, and polarization, how that interacts to affect how people interpret information? And then secondly, when we talk about the role of information linking to service provision, this could presumably vary depending on the policy domain. So there are certain actions like cash transfers, like budgeting for agriculture that the government does, but there's other services, health, education, electricity that are relying on a service provider mediating. So you have this long route of accountability. So just wondering, based on the collection of papers you have, whether that domain plays a difference in terms of information making that link to service provision.
Thank you very much. And then
Apologies. Jordan Kyle. I was an associate research fellow at IFPRI before. I'm at the Tony Blair Institute now. I actually wrote down questions for everyone, but I'm going to confine myself to just a couple of them. I found these presentations really fascinating. So I guess first for David Evans, I was thinking a lot about what it means that some villages are holding all these meetings and what it means that some villages aren't. And I guess from a factual perspective, I was curious whether baseline trust is already higher in the places where meetings are held, or if you really need something like resources plus that deliberation to yield the higher trust. And kind of following on from that, can you tell if it's that trust goes up in villages that disseminate information well and deliberate, or if it goes down in villages that don't once they get the resources, like how are citizens updating in those two universes? And I think then the downstream thing is, it strikes me that the finding suggests we get these two types of villages, where you have good politicians, you give them resources, you give them a program to implement, and you get this positive feedback loop where the program's implemented well, citizens can see it, and they trust their government. Which is great for the next program that comes down the line. And then you get this other set of villages where politicians aren't holding these kind of meetings or not deliberating, you get the resources, and citizens you don't get that positive trust. And so what are the set of tools that can break out of that kind of positive and negative feedback loops, I guess? And I'll leave it there. Although I had, I guess, one question for Leonard, which was that, I was curious whether information, this kind of builds on a point Danielle made about information and institutional context, that even if information isn't impacting voting choice, we know from some literature that information can directly impact service delivery, which can downstream influence politics in various ways. And I was just curious kind of how that relationship is playing into the political campaign questions.
Jordan, thank you very much. I hope in the next round, if we have time, we can take some more, if not, engaging afterwards. We have Joachim von Braun in the first row. If you can pass a mic to Joachim in the first row.
Thank you. Joachim von Braun, University of Bonn in Germany. Great topic. Thank you for the presentations. I look forward to read it. My first question is, what's the concept of information which you apply? Leonard, you mentioned the endogeneity issue. The quantity and quality issues were touched upon. Do you have a common framework of information as such? My second small question is in relation to the women's groups work, NEA. we see in a couple of studies which we have done and others too a middle class effect of group formation and defining middle class in the local content. How does this influence power of information and domination of utilization of information? So there would be a downside of selective absorptive capacity of information in then also driving and using rural services. Thank you.
Joachim, thank you very much. I know we have other hands up, but I'll come to them in the second round. Let me go now to our panelists. And as I do that, can I ask a question myself, which I imagine others in the audience may also ask, picking up on Joachim? How do you define rural services? It might be something you may just want to say a word or two on that. What are the rural services you focus on? Why don't we begin with Katrina and Leonard first and then go to the other authors?
Great. Thank you for that suite of questions. Definitely thought-provoking. So I guess I'll touch on a few of them and allow others, including Leonard, to address some of the other ones. Danielle Resnick raises the really good point that information may really not be neutral, and there's a lot of people with very vested interests in making people believe certain things, I guess, is one of the implications, using information for their advantage, and I think that is hugely important to take into account. I touched a little bit on the identity of the sender being very important for their credibility and for people's beliefs in that information. So I think, in a sense, we want some sort of a competitive marketplace to come about, right? Where good information drives out the bad information. On the other hand, it's easy in that type of a setting to get into information overload pretty quickly, where we can't really distinguish between what's true and what's fake news. So I think this is a thorny issue, and I think finding increasingly important ways of certifying information and making information objective might be very important in this direction of trying to make sure the information brings about good outcomes rather than bad. But I think it's a very thought-provoking issue because it really, whether information is neutral or not, depends on the information and the context. Let's see. Maybe I will save some further thoughts on Jordan's question to Dave and our paper for Dave. But I very quickly wanted to just say we did look at correlates of number of meetings using baseline data and did not find a lot of correlates, including trust. Which was kind of honestly surprising to us. We thought that places that the law said that there had to be at least 4 meetings per year. Every quarter there needs to be a meeting, and about half of villages complied and half did not. And being in the half that's the compliers really was not a big predictor of trust or even socioeconomic status, average of the village. So in some sense, we kind of hope that that we can interpret these as somewhat more of a causal mediator, but we did not randomize meetings, so clearly that's kind of a caveat. I'm going to turn over to Leonard for some of these big questions, institutional questions.
Yeah, those are a great question. So basically, depending on the project, information can be like just presenting basic facts or finding. For instance, when information about in education sector would be to share with parents, like test score and information about teachers' performance and so on. That's factual. Now, in political economy setting is information about candidates' platform and what the candidate stand for, and what the candidate, for instance, would like or is planning to do for the next few years or something. As opposed to, sharing information about his family, his or her family, and religious belief and so on. It's about specific policy and where the candidate stand for. Now, we can also think about information on, which is some kind of research result. Especially in governance. Something like basically ideas on how services could be improved, and see how the adoption, to what extent those ideas are adopted and acted upon by. So what we mean by information can be very, very diverse depending on the context. But the challenge here is why something that ex ante sounds so natural and positive sometimes has no effect or negative effect. So, and it's still a very, very open question. That's why issues about norm, about institutions, about partisanship and all that play a very, very important role. So a lot of work needs to be done. But I mean, the point here is that we need to get at those issues as much as possible, as hard as possible, so that we can think about better way we can make information matter. Better way we can get informed individuals to be willing to have a more positive outlook about governments, about communities as a result of the information that they receive. And I think this is where we want to get at. So again, this is just the beginning. I think about what I hope will be an extremely productive and insightful research on the issue. We are trying to sort of lay some ground here, and hopefully it could lead to more research on the topic.
I'm sure we'll come back to that in the next round, but let's take David, Neha, and then if Tewadaj wishes to comment also.
So Jordan, thanks again for that question. And like Katrina said, it really doesn't seem, so one of our concerns when we saw this result was, okay, maybe you're basically in a good community, like a good governance community or a bad governance community. So we looked around for that. Like Katrina said, we don't see variations in the trust levels in governments. We don't see any systematic variations in the income levels, which is one of the other things you might expect. Like these are all relatively poor communities, but they're not all equally poor. And so we don't see that, that it's like, oh, the rich communities are the ones who have, more of everything. So across our data, we just don't see any systematic alignment between communities that had more of these meetings and other characteristics. Now, obviously, we can't rule out everything, but what that does suggest is there is potentially a space there for a more technocratic response, right? That there are some communities are just like most of us in workplaces have been at workplaces where they have, good meetings and effective meetings, and we've probably all been in workplaces where we have lots of terrible meetings, and obviously it's not exactly the same thing, but I think there is something similar where there's an opportunity to help communities be more effective in leveraging these, especially insofar as this is actually beneficial to the leaders who are running these meetings, right? This isn't, it is in their interest to be communicating more, and some just might not be that effective at doing it. And so, as Leonard talked about in his final, in some of the experiments they're doing in Benin and the Philippines, helping give people templates for how to do this effectively has the potential, obviously not to solve all the governance problems, but to help these service delivery programs bring vulnerable people more into the social contract.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, Joachim, for your question. The middle class effect, that happens. I didn't have time to mention that in our data comes from areas where the upper castes are actually the minority in our sample. So the marginalized castes are actually, they constitute 70% of our sample. But even so, in related work, we find that determinants of being a member, we find women who are older, women who have greater assets, they're more likely to be members. So that happens. However, within a group, it's pretty homogeneous. So if you are targeting groups to deliver information, if you deliver it to a particular group, it will get disseminated. So I guess it's as the policymaker or the NGO who's trying to target, that's where you kind of decide if this is the kind of information you want to give to more marginalized people, poor people. You'd kind of target those kinds of groups because they are, they are kind of aligned around these caste and class categories. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, the comment about ideas, the role of ideas and norms, is something that was sort of hovering in the back of our minds a little bit. It wasn't sort of an integral part of the research questions we were asking, but I think that it potentially really mattered in Nigeria, because when we compare, for example, the phenomenon of the chief executives having this outsized power vis-a-vis the agricultural leaders, etc., this issue is acknowledged when we talked even more informally even with our collaborators and others. It's certainly acknowledged as an issue, but it's in stark contrast to that of the local governments that have no control or very, very limited control over their budgets. As an idea, it's such a hot topic. It's all over the media. Again, our collaborators and others, people take deep interest in this, even if they're not local government chairman, for example. And I had pondered whether this is actually not a matter of ideas being different, but maybe collective action being stronger in the case of the local government agencies and authorities. But that's not the case, because we actually tried to meet with the association of all local governments, and they didn't seem to be it's not an office, it's one individual, and he was not really, he said home, so we'd have to visit him at home. We didn't do that. Whereas the agricultural state ministers have a very serious association that meets every year, and even our office, our Nigeria office in IFPRI, I still say our, may I? we used to interact with them. So it's not so much because, the local government chairmen are really out there, very well organized and institutionalized as a power group, as an interest group, but rather it's just this idea. At least that's sort of my perception. But again, it doesn't go beyond perception in our case, because we haven't really studied this formally. Of course, my colleague can also come in if you'd like to say something about this. But just one more point on this. There was a very serious push. While I haven't seen I haven't heard or seen any changes in the power of agricultural sector leaders to actually make budgetary decisions, there had been a very serious push, it was about a year and a half ago, to change explicitly the constitution of Nigeria to make it, to enable the local governments to control their budget, even though it is in the constitution, but there was sort of additional amendments were supposed to be added. So I don't know if this is ideas, it could be, but I think you may be onto something in our context.
Dewadaj, thank you very much. Let me come back to the room. And as I do that, I will also ask if Joachim, did you feel that your question had been addressed, the first one? And if not, I will ask you if you want to elaborate on that. You're welcome to do so. But let me come back to Will Martin. And I saw your hand up, if the other hand's up also. Will, and then...
Thank you. Yeah. Will Martin from IFPRI. Dewadaj, your point about Nigeria, the principle of subsidiarity always seems like a really good one. Push the decision down to where the people know what's going on and their preferences are more relevant. But higher levels of government typically like to interfere. Now, as I understand it, in Nigeria, though, the allocation of funds from federal to state has always been based on population. And I've always thought of that as kind of a disaster because they haven't been able to run censuses because of that link to funding. But it seems like there might be a silver lining to this problem in the sense that you're finding that the top level, the federal government, doesn't interfere, but the perhaps natural tendency to interfere shows up further down where perhaps it's not population-based. And I just wonder, is that something that's going on there?
Could pass the mic to Tolu in the front here.
Tolu Olafemi. I'm actually interested in your intervention, Leonard, in Benin, because I'm thinking about the voter engagement, and you were talking about bureaucrats in the room and the mayor is not there, and I'm thinking about Nigeria and having a bunch of bureaucrats in the room without the governor. I'm just wondering how the results of this meeting, this engagement, this indigenous ideas get past the governor.
Much. I then come back to Joachim, to whom I'd given a little offer, and then I will come back.
Thank you, Rajul. I feel nudged by you.
Worked with you several times.
I think you did answer in the directions, but let me maybe make a simple comment. In a development economics context, I think an information concept that works with expected costs or costs and expected benefits over time would be a useful approach, because there are costs for information providing, information absorbing, and some information which you get now may have very long-term payoffs. So an economic value chain concept around information might make sense in order to push the frontiers of developmental investment in information.
Thank you very much. We have Brian right there. Panelists, if you will allow me. I beg your pardon? Okay. Oh. We also have a question within the panel, but if you will allow me, let me take these questions and then we can give you time. Brian first.
Thank you. Brian Greenberg, independent consultant, and great presentations, great topic. I think, without meaning to push too hard on Danielle's point, I think I'm following up a similar point. It strikes me that that the idea of information is fundamentally contested at present, and that it's not as helpful as an analytic term as perhaps we might want to get at here. There seems to be, and I may be incorrect about this, in hearing the presentations there was a sense that information is somehow data or is on the objective end of things. It is based in truth somehow. There's something verifiable about information. And I just wanted to suggest that in most contexts, it is the claims to objectivity are what are at issue. And there is a whole spectrum of things that I maybe should be better called communications or messaging that are emitted. So much is spin these days. People are aware of that in even remote locations. So they're not taking it as if it were simple knowledge that simply goes into an individual rational being and eventually generates the behaviors that we would like to see. There is this domain in which there's engagement between propositions, perhaps. That's also a term that people put out, that are received not by neutral recipients, but people with psychologies and cultural backgrounds and norms that are conditioning how they interpret. And interpretation is another critical issue here. So you have this whole field of communication or missed communication a lot of the time, but it doesn't depend on objectivity and rationality most of the time. We're seeing much more complex political and cultural things worked out here. And you guys are doing a great job of getting at it, but I'm just wondering if we need to interrogate information.
And thank you so much. We have one more hand up there. That's Frank Place. Wow, panelists, I believe, permit me to take one or two, and then I'll come back to Neha too. There's a lot of, yeah.
Hi, yes, I'm Frank Place from the Policies, Institutions, and Markets program. So thanks very much for the very interesting policy seminar today. So my question is related to when I hear the concepts such as information, social capital, institutions, things like that, I think of long-term processes in my mind. So when we're in the systematic review that you did, when you looked at the effects of information and things, were these generally short-term kinds of effects, or did some studies look at longer-term effects, or is that even possible to do with rigor in given our methods that we have?
Thank you very much. Let me come to Neha. You had a question yourself.
Thanks, Rajul. So I have a question for Dave and I guess Katrina, since you're a co-author. I know you only had 6 minutes, so you may have rushed through it. So in your presentation, you said places which had bigger impacts were the ones where there were meetings, more meetings, and was it one of your recommendations to have more meetings? So I would just be a little wary of recommending more meetings just because we don't know what is the optimal number of meetings. So I guess maybe investigate more on like what is the optimal number. And I'm saying this because just in the work we are doing in India with where different interventions are being layered on top of women's groups, they're required to attend multiple meetings to, learn this, learn that, and like just kind of getting a grasp on what is needed and what is like, so yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I'll take now the final comment from the room for the gentleman over there. Panelists, we have a whole menu here.
Thank you very much. These were a set of excellent presentations. Actually, my question is related to Neha's. In terms of the question she asked at the end.
Tell us who you are, please.
Mekbib Haile, an economist from the World Bank. When I think of the topic information, what came into my mind before coming here was ICT, digital. And then one of the key factors for information to be important was the incentive factor. So when you have this ICT and digital as opportunity and you want to reduce the cost for information sharing, what comes to mind is actually virtual groups, which Neha kind of marked about WhatsApps, and also virtual meetings. So my question here is, have you considered what's the impact of these virtual groups or virtual meetings? Have you done any analysis on that? What kind of outcome would they have on information sharing and also other governance-related outcomes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been an incredible array of comments, questions, reflections, and so forth. Panelists, I will ask you, sadly, be selective in what you respond and allow us the last 2 minutes to kind of give final messages. Katrina, would you like to begin or would you like to have the last word?
Sure. I'll begin. Thank you guys for the host of questions. I feel like there's a question that's, we haven't really answered Rajul's question up front, which was rural services and what do we mean by this? We are looking at a lot of different services and Danielle has alluded to this fact that different services may have very different routes to accountability. And so that can absolutely matter. So we definitely don't mean to homogenize all different types of services. Tewadaj and I are now actually looking at different incentives for governments to deliver productive versus social services. And so the characteristics of the services really matter, whether, so that's one way you can look at characteristics. So I definitely take that point that there are different setups. These setups also, I can't say that education has a particular route to accountability because it's going to vary by context. But I think that's part of Leonard's broader institutional point. We need to take the specific context into account. What is the pathway to accountability? Who are the key actors? And what are the incentives of the actors themselves? Looping back to Joachim's point, I think it's really important to think about the concept of information that we're applying. We're in an interdisciplinary journal, and I think this is sort of the way I'm conceiving of it. Leonard may have different takes on this, but this idea that you mentioned and put it well, the cost and expected benefits framework is really key, and I think we are thinking about this. I guess in this space, I'd say, though, that one of the key things to bring in is that there's lots of uncertainty that characterizes this, and knowing what the costs are, there's just a very big confidence interval around a lot of this. So to me, the idea of knowing that information can be verified or certified, that the reputation of the sender, that their reputation matters to them, that they have their own incentives going forward if they're found to be not credible in a particular instance and their credibility has been tarnished. Knowing the incentives even the sender has is really important as well in sort of making these decisions in a context of a lot of uncertainty. I won't say more to give everyone else time.
Yes, okay, good. So I think the points made are well taken. So to come back to the information conceptual issues, so I agree that we need more theorizing. There is a huge literature on information acquisition, information asymmetries. I mean, it's huge, but then it's not always tightly connected to the empirical experiential literature. That's something that needs to be done. And for instance, this could lead to classify information. Like, for instance, some information treatment are fact, just basic fact that people might not know. It could be about an opinion, sometimes opinion based on like research with better credibility than others. And then what we talk about norms and bias could be an outcome variable. For instance, if you look at the deliberative polls literature, what it measures is to see to what extent information, factual information, followed by back and forth exchanges, lead to more convergence, lead to less partisanship. You see what I mean? So, but I think what we are trying to argue is that we need to reduce. So first of all, we need to make sure that information is better theorized than it is. That we need to be as clear, simple, and basic as possible as what we mean by information treatment, and then that we sort of take into consideration the institutional context, how the information is given, to look at this, the profile of the different players, the bias, the belief they have into how we do this, and then to and more importantly, again, to see whether, even if information doesn't change like the outcome, if it change belief, change behavior, it's a big step, and so on. Now, coming back to the question on Benin, I was not very detailed about what we did. Basically, we want the mayor out of, so that his presence or her presence is not intimidating to the participants, but the chief of staff is there as a moderator. And then after the meeting, there will be a report about what people are not just going to say what they think, they are going to make decisions about what to do. And that decision, to some degree, is imposed. I mean, 50% or will be imposed on the mayor. So, and that's what we said earlier, what Katrina said earlier. So when information come anonymously from the participant, and people feel that what come out has power, can be implemented, then the impact is different. So that's why we try to do. So it's not just eliciting information from individuals, is that what comes out is something that they control, especially its application.
David, would you like to comment?
Thank you. I think just two quick thoughts. I think Brian's point about kind of what information is, and we think of this as often think of this as fact sharing. A lot of the work I've done historically has been in the education world, where it's about sharing some sort of objective information about test scores across schools and getting people to react. Whereas here I think we're definitely using it in a broader sense. In these community meetings, there actually isn't a specific agenda. We aren't, the project isn't controlling. And really, it's an opportunity for deliberation, right? The community leaders share some information, but these community meetings are what they really are. They're town halls where so the information is the opportunity to deliberate. Really similar in some ways to what was happening in Benin. Per Neha's question, I think this question of are we recommending more meetings, and we should be careful on that. I personally can't stand meetings, and so I think that's a worthy caution. I do think there's a fundamental difference between the kind of meeting we're talking about. So a lot of women's groups, a lot of cash transfer programs have these obligatory meetings that people have to participate in if they want to receive the benefit. So that's not what is happening in our context at all. These are community meetings that are completely optional. Cash transfers are not conditioned on participation in these community meetings. So what we're looking at, the low community meeting villages, are communities where they're having maybe 1 or 2 meetings over the course of an entire year to discuss what they're doing with resources. So adding additional meetings in those communities isn't actually putting an undue burden on community members. It's giving them an opportunity which they can avail themselves of if they so choose. And so that's why I'd feel a little bit more confident that more meetings in some of those communities, and especially meetings used well, conceivably with templates and training to help make sure those are helpful for community members, is likely to be a good choice.
I guess the idea of information and like how it's used, how it's conceived, it's been talked about a lot, and I think I would just kind of concur with what Katrina said. I guess it's kind of who's telling you what you're being told. You trust people, so I guess it's the source that'll give credibility to the content that's being delivered. Also in the context, like when we do a lot of data collection, we ask them, do you know about this scheme? And people will, even if they don't know, they might just take a guess and say yes. So we do have follow-up questions when we ask them, okay, so what does it do? What benefits do you get out? And that's where we find that many people, even when they know of certain schemes, they don't know what the benefits are. So it's not sufficient to give information about the scheme being present, but also educating people about the benefits that it confers. So yeah, I mean, it's not as easy as it may have sounded.
Thank you, Neha. Now, Tevodaj, any responses to these?
Yeah, I'll be very selective and focus on Will's question, since that was directed to me. I agree with you, actually. This is actually, in a way, all else equal, with always that caveat, a positive that in the case of the federal-state relationship, you do not have the level of meddling that, from the federal government into the state's budget, the way we saw one tier down. The point I guess I was trying to make is that, first of all, this asymmetry between what's going on in this inter-tier relationships, slightly above and below. And the second is the fact that it kind of goes into the other extreme. I mean, just to give you an example, we met with the director of budget for the Federal Minister of Agriculture, so the person responsible for budget making, who would have a very legitimate interest in knowing what states are spending so that they can, for example, harmonize federal resources to be complementary, to kind of take information on board from the state level on the spending side. The director of budget, this is just one example, the director of budget had no idea, but was keenly interested. So what he had his staff do is scour through state-level newspapers, state by state, to get a sense on what are they actually spending money on. Now, you won't find a nice table or data set in a newspaper, but that was the best that he can do. And when we approached him with a request for data at the state level, because we don't want to go to the individual states, very soon we learned that, we said, that's fine with the newspapers, we'll go. So we realized we had to do sort of field work. So the point was really there just to say it is the other extreme. So there is no meddling, but there's also no information that would allow coordination and harmonization. Just one quick point on the formula. There are actually formula that apply to local government allocations as well. And these are formula not devised by the states, but by the country, really, by Nigeria. In the federation account, based on population, based on some metrics of poverty, some proxies, based on existing levels of services, they would assign how much local governments get. But that formula is just sort of blown out of the park, and the states do what they want. It was really, truly striking, both in terms of the grand total allocations that states allow local governments to actually have, because it passes through the state, but also in terms of the allocation within the budget and within the sectors. So.
Tevodaj, thank you very much. I know there were questions we couldn't answer because of time issues, and I think there are some ideas that have been raised for further work, including virtual meetings, virtual modalities, longer term, and I hope they will pick them up. But let me now give the final word to each of our panelists, 10, 20 seconds, 30 seconds maximum. What is the final message you want to leave our audience with? David, Neha, Tevodaj, Leonard, Katrina.
So we see massive variation across contexts and across interventions about what actually the impact of providing more information is. But insofar as we're decentralizing resources to communities, it can't be a bad thing to build more systems so that communities have an opportunity to deliberate about those resources.
I think women's groups interventions do have a potential for empowering women to hold public entities accountable, but we shouldn't just rely on them to take everything forward. They need resources and they need support.
Thank you. Well, I glossed a little bit over the policy issues at the end, even though that is really important. And the reason is, it is actually hard to generate change when there's such entrenched interest in the system to keep things the way they are. And so one impetus I'd like to give from the research with Tolu is that maybe change has to, in part, be at least supported from outside. So, for example, when either donor agencies or international development organizations engage on agriculture, engage with states, that they not only think about providing funding for specific programs, but think about the process through which decisions are made and try to encourage, even if it's gently, try to encourage a process that actually brings on board information and expertise on agriculture in the decision-making process.
So yeah, I think information processing and the power of information is something that we all recognize. So the next big step will be to see to what extent we can improve in the way information can be very effective to reducing poverty and promoting growth.
I'd like to thank everyone for this. I want to finish with something that Frank Place mentioned, because I think it's very important for kind of bringing this home, which is the issue of short versus long-term impacts. And I'll say that one of the features I found of many RCTs is they are often short-term focused. There's sort of new generations that are looking at much longer follow-up studies, but often you have a bit more bias and weight towards the short-term impacts. What I think is particularly remarkable to me about information is the fact that receipt of that information can have an enduring impact just in theory without running, a follow-up study. If you learn through civic education how your government operates, you don't readily forget that information. If you get access because government set up a government website, often that website will be up for a long period of time disseminating information. If you get a set of town hall meetings running, those can continue and build off one another and stay. So I feel like there's a staying power of information that's very important and definitely lends a lot of promise to it.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. And then please read the articles, share the articles, and then let's support further work on this. Thank you very much.